Yesterday we were looking at section 8, the advent of John, so the birth of John the Baptist, and we were partway through section 9, the Annunciation of the birth of Jesus to Joseph. We saw some interesting things there concerning Joseph and his response, what he was told to do, all of those things. So we are almost finished with section 9, and let's see, what was the last number that we did? Is it 59, I think, right?
Yeah.
All right, number 60 is a think question. Why was naming the child Jesus not a contradiction of the prophecy of Isaiah quoted in Matthew 1:23? If you remember, that quotation said that his name would be called Emmanuel. Well, they didn't call him that. They called him Jesus. So isn't that a contradiction? What did you think about that? Sam, did you have any thoughts?
I had Emmanuel means God with us, and God was there. And Jesus is God, so.
But they didn't call him that, did they? So what's the solution to that problem? You're right, that's what it means. It all applies to Jesus, but they didn't call him that. So is the prophecy wrong? Anybody have a solution? Brennan?
Like Samuel said, but also God is all salvation and Yahweh is God. So it's not contradicting it because they still call him Emmanuel. He's still God with them.
What do you mean they still call him Emmanuel?
Like the angels, like when Gabriel said that they would still call him Emmanuel. And it is Yahweh is salvation and Yahweh is God. So God is with
Okay.
us. So
All right.
it is like not making it.
All right, that's good thinking. I'll give you a bonus point for that. The answer is also that Emmanuel, being called Emmanuel doesn't mean that that was necessarily the name that was given to him. That's what he was called, in that he was called God with us. In other words, that wasn't his name, but that was a designation of who he was. That was a description of who he was. So this was a descriptive name, not a proper name. You follow that? It was a descriptive name that he would be called Emmanuel. All right, let's go to number 61, an evaluate question. Why did Joseph and Mary not engage in sexual relations until the birth of Jesus? Why do you think that was the case? Luke?
They didn't want anyone to doubt that was a virgin birth.
Exactly. Good. So there'd be no doubt that Jesus was born of a virgin. How many had something like that? Okay, you didn't put your hands up to answer the question. Come on, guys. Leave me here hanging. I got to search around and find somebody who has an answer. Put your hands up if you have one. We'll count that as a bonus point too. I'm afraid we're getting more bonus points than we are regular points. I don't know. Are we? Maybe the next section will help us make up for it. Section 10, the advent of the king, the coming of the king. All right, we see there that we have a decree going out from Caesar Augustus. And so Joseph and Mary have to go down to Bethlehem to register for that census. And we find that when they arrive there, it's time for her to give birth. Now let me just say a word about the date here. If you look at a lot of commentaries or study Bibles, they may indicate that the birth of Jesus took place in maybe 5 or 4 BC. Some say as early as 6 BC. I think more recent scholarship has enabled us to move that date closer to 2 BC. And the reason for that is that, of course, they didn't have anything with the date written on it back then, so we say Well, here's something that says this happened in 5 BC, because that would be impossible, because it was BC, something that didn't come into existence for hundreds of years later. So we have to date according to events that are written down. And Josephus talks about the death of Herod the Great. Most of the copies of Josephus's writings that we have today indicate that Herod died around 4 BC, and therefore Jesus had been born before he died, obviously. But it's been discovered in recent years that the copies we have of Josephus there was an error in copying something way back. So in other words, the earlier copies now that have been found of Josephus indicate that Herod probably died more likely in 2 BC, which means then that the birth of Jesus could have been in 2 or 3 BC, and I think the possibility is that he was actually born in 2 BC. Now, I don't know if you understand all that or not, but it is based upon the writings of Josephus, which apparently had a corruption and error in some of the copies that we then used, and now earlier copies have been found which seem to correct what was an erroneous time frame. So I think that if we want to put a date to it, if you want to put a time frame on there, I think we can very easily say that Jesus was born 2 years before Christ. All right, which sounds kind of odd, but that's just because of the person that came up with the BC AD years later didn't know when Jesus was born exactly, kind of guessed at it, and so we have that anomaly that Jesus was born in 2 BC. All right, now notice here the providence of God. As we're looking at this passage, or what happens, it begins with a census proclaimed by the Roman emperor, and it's that census that gets Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, which is where it was prophesied that the Messiah would be born. So Joseph and Mary weren't thinking ahead, oh, let's see, where should we go for our Messiah to be born? They apparently weren't thinking about that, maybe weren't aware of that scripture, but it took God moving a Roman emperor to get them to where they needed to be. Mary's already pregnant in Nazareth, but she has to give birth in Bethlehem. How are they going to get there? Well, the Roman emperor brought about that result. And so we see in number 62, who determined that the census of the Roman Empire would be undertaken? This should be an easy one for you, Morgan. Pardon me?
Caesar Augustus.
Caesar Augustus is exactly right. Caesar Augustus. Any question? Research or remember. Remember if you had world history, and research maybe if you haven't. Why was the census undertaken? Why did Caesar Augustus say we need to have a census? Jonas?
So he could tax the people.
Couldn't he tax them without a census?
But so they could count, make sure they're all paying it right.
Okay, so to tax them fairly was the idea. To make sure that they were taxed appropriately, so that every area weren't paying the same taxes, and yet some areas might have less people. So he initiated this in order to ensure that all parts of the Roman Empire were taxed appropriately. All right, he was trying to be a good king or emperor over his empire. Any question about that? How many had something similar to that? All right, good. Number 2, how often was or part 2 under 63, how often was a census undertaken? What did you find there, Griff?
Every 10 years.
No. Landon?
It was the first one.
No. Emma?
Every 5 years.
No. Anybody look back in your world history notes? Jonas?
Every 6 years.
No. Noel?
Every 14 years.
Every 14 years. How many had 14? All right. I'm not sure where your other numbers came from. It was every 14 years there was supposed to be a census. And then why was it necessary for everyone to go to his town of ancestry? Anybody find that? Luke, did you find something?
Is that like because that's where their family line came from?
Okay, so, but why did they have to go there to be counted? This was kind of complicated. We certainly won't count this as a point. Roman census law required that property owners must deliver his tax declaration in the city in which the property lay. Now, according to Jewish law, your family owned the property, and that property was never to go out of the possession of the family. And if it did, every 50th year, the year of Jubilee, it was to go back to the original owners. So that God did that so that a particular family would not lose their land. Eventually, they would always have that land back, because a landless people become a wandering people, and God had given them the land of Canaan to live in. And then, so for the Jews, it was necessary to go back to their ancestral home where they came from, because that's where the family land was. There's a tribal connection. So it was required by Jewish laws of inheritance that they go to Bethlehem, because that's where the family was from. Okay, does that make sense? Not that I expect you to really understand that looking it up. But part of the whole culture here and of getting them to Bethlehem. All right, so number 1 you should have been able to find. Number 2 under 63, parts 1 and 2 you should have been able to find. Part 3 we won't count that, but we'll count the first 2 parts. Any questions? All right, 64 is a think question. Why does Luke mention Quirinius? Why does he mention him? Noel?
As a historical reference.
Exactly. It gives historical context. So we know that Luke is centering his recounting of the events in historical context of real history. How many had something like that? Okay, good. We'll count that question. That should have been relatively easy. All right, number 65. Imagine. How did this young couple travel? How did they travel? Morgan?
On foot.
How many said on foot? Okay. Some of you said some other way. Griff, what'd you say?
They traveled on a donkey.
On a donkey. How many said on a donkey? Okay. Any others? A train? Brenna?
I said on foot. Joseph was on foot and Mary was riding on the donkey.
So Joseph was on foot and Mary's on a donkey. Okay. How many of you had something like that? Okay. Is there a way for us to know? Well, let me ask you this. Does the gospel account say how they traveled? Where do we get the idea of a donkey then? Hmm?
It was a common animal to have then. And it would have been too.
You know what the primary reason why we have the idea of a donkey? Because that's what's on all the Christmas cards. Isn't that the image that comes to your mind? The pictures you saw on Christmas cards? Or other Christmas related stuff? Or maybe the manger scene, the donkeys there that they rode? Let me give you a reason why they probably did not ride on a donkey. That they probably went on foot. Number 1, donkey was an expensive animal. It was not something everyone owned. It would be like having a Porsche or a Lamborghini, I suppose. Donkeys were what was ridden by kings and wealthy people. Now, maybe they were wealthy. Is there any reason to think that they weren't wealthy? Yes, there is. Because later on, when Jesus is born and Joseph and Mary take him to the temple to be circumcised and to name him, there is a particular sacrifice that God had prescribed for people to give when they were doing that procedure. But the law provided that if they could not afford that one, they could simply offer a couple of doves or pigeons, because those were pretty common, just like they are in any city. What did Joseph and Mary offer? Did they offer the normal sacrifice? No, they offered the one that only poor people who didn't have anything would offer. So that indicates to me they probably did not have a donkey.
How would Mary travel though if she was pregnant?
That would have been pretty tough, wouldn't it? She's traveling a long way, walking all the way. Not just at the beginnings of her pregnancy either, because she gives birth pretty soon after they get there. So she's very pregnant. I can only say is that women were tough back then. They were used to walking. That's how they got everywhere. You know, in some cultures, I've read that a woman, after she gives birth, immediately gets up, goes out and works in the fields. And the man stays in with the baby. So a lot of it is how you're raised. Women in many cultures are tough enough to just keep on going. And Mary was tough enough to walk all that way being pregnant. Maybe that even helped the birthing along. Maybe that by the time she got there, she was ready to give birth. Any questions? So try to eliminate the myth of riding the donkey from your minds, because it probably did not happen. Right?
Is it wrong if we put the donkey?
Oh, we're not going to count that one.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was an imagined question, so we're not going to count that. Tell you what if you did put on foot, we'll give you a bonus point. Some of you are going to have so many bonus points that are going to be coming out your ears. All right, number 66 says, look at a map and speculate upon the difficulties of such a journey. All right, so looking at a map and seeing how far they had to go, and especially if you looked at a topographical map, one that shows mountains and stuff. Anybody write down anything, something about the journey that you think we might be interested in? Jordan, what'd you say?
It was 90 miles.
It was 90 miles. And that's straight though, right? That's not all the crooks and turns probably. So if you consider that they didn't have any interstate highways to walk straight on, we could figure probably figure around 100 miles. What else? 100 miles of what kind of walking? Was it downhill all the way? Anybody else? Lexi?
There were hills surrounding Jerusalem.
Yeah, there were certainly hills around Jerusalem. In fact, in the whole area, one of the things that struck me when I was in Israel was just how mountainous everything was. You kind of think about maybe Jerusalem being on a high hill and it's flat all around, but it's rocky and mountainous all over much of Israel. So they're walking through a lot of mountainous areas, a lot of rocky areas. Probably a path, because this was a well-worn way to go for people from Galilee down to Jerusalem. And we're not sure whether they went through Samaria or not, whether it was a straight route, which would have been around 100 miles, or whether they crossed over the Jordan on the other side, like most Jewish people did to avoid Samaria, and that would make it even longer, and plus crossing the river twice. Any other thoughts on the journey? Did anybody think about whether they would be traveling alone or not? Have we thought about that? Any other thoughts? All right, I hope that you get beyond, I just have to do these questions for a grade and begin to interact with the text and think about these things. Use your imagination. So, that's the best way to get involved with what's there and to see what's there. All right, you had some research. Find 3 important events that had occurred at Bethlehem prior to this. Bethlehem was a small town, but there were some important things that occurred there. Give me one thing, Noah.
The Star of Bethlehem.
Not before this. That was after this. So you can't count that one. You have another one?
No.
So you're supposed to find 3 things and you didn't find any, so that'd be 3 points off, I'm sorry to say. Let's see, who else? Who have we heard from? Marissa, give me one.
It was a very large city and then it declined back to a small village.
Okay, I'm not sure that's an event, but, okay, that is something about Bethlehem. Emma? Well, do you have 3 things written down?
I have one. I couldn't find anything.
Mia?
David was crowned king there.
All right, David was from there. What else? Haley?
Rachel was married.
Rachel's buried there. Who's Rachel? Noel?
Jacob's wife.
Right. His favorite wife, right? And the mother of Joseph and Benjamin. In fact, she died giving birth to Benjamin. All right, what else happened in Bethlehem? Landon, do you have something?
Had the star.
Okay, you see the word prior there. How many had the star? Only the people, okay, a few other. Prior to this, do you know the word prior? Before this. Joel, do you have something more?
I have it was built as a fortified city.
Okay, that's again not an event, but all right, you found something about Bethlehem. At this point, I'm desperate for anything about Bethlehem. Noel,
Ruth's setting is near there.
pardon me?
The setting for Ruth.
Okay, all right. What happens in Ruth takes place near there. All right, Brenna?
Many Jews stayed there after the Babylonian exile and found a place of refuge.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that, but that sounds good. Amelia, do you have anything more? If you, I'm not sure what your modus operandi was here, but if you simply went to Bible Gateway and Googled Bethlehem, I'm sure it occurs a lot of times in the Old Testament, and you could have just simply looked up those different things. A guy by the name of Ibzan died and was buried at Bethlehem in Judges 12. In Judges 17, a Levite from Bethlehem became a priest for a man. Naomi's family's from Bethlehem, as was kind of stated. David's from there. A guy by the name of Asahel was buried there in 2 Samuel 2. And in 2 Samuel 23, 3 mighty men retrieved a cup of water for David from a well there. David had a hankering for some hometown water, so they went and got that for him. All right, so a number of things that you could have picked from. So 3 points for that question. Number 68 was to research the meaning of Bethlehem and then analyze the significance. Okay, quickly, what's the meaning of Bethlehem? Bethlehem.
House of Lambs.
Lambs? No. Where'd you find that? That's not it. Jordan?
House of bread.
House of bread. Lachem is the word for bread. The bread. Now, what's the significance of that? Lexi?
I had house of flesh.
Flesh? Okay, I need to see where you got these answers because that's,
The same way where I found where it said flesh, it also said bread. Like it said both.
okay. When I learned Hebrew, Lachem was the word bread. I never saw the word flesh there, so if it's used that way, I don't know.
I think in other terms, I think from reading, because I looked it up, there was like different culture, like different languages called it those different things, but Hebrew was the house of bread for other places.
All right,
It was
so
the
other
same.
similar languages may have a word that's like that. Marissa?
It says Arabic is the house of meat or house of lambs, and Hebrew is house of bread.
Thank you. So you guys are looking at Arabic. We want to know Hebrew. Very good, Marissa. Thanks for clearing that up. All right. Yeah, and Arabic is similar to Hebrew in some ways. Doesn't look much alike, but the sounds of the words are similar. So that's the confusion. Make sure you're looking. If I'm asking for a meaning of a Hebrew word, make sure you're looking for the Hebrew meaning, not Arabic or something else. All right. So it's house of bread. What's the significance of that? It's called the house of bread. Anybody come up with the significance? Lexi?
Well, I have flesh, but then I said that Jesus is God in flesh.
All right, if you're using the Arabic, then that would be a good significance. Jordan?
I said because Jesus is born and Jesus is the bread of life.
Exactly. The bread of life was born in the house of bread. Isn't that cool? Yeah. So you should be able to. I guess we won't count 68 since you're looking at Arabic instead of Hebrew. Next time, make sure you get the right language. All right, so we won't count 68. 69, research the use of cloths with newborns. What'd you find out about using cloths with newborns? John, did you find anything?
Just to wrap them in something after they're born.
Okay, so they wrap them up after they're born. Anybody find out why? Mia?
It's like supposed to help the baby transition from the womb.
Yeah, because the baby's used to being in a nice, warm, and closed place, so the wrapping in cloths would help them with that. Any other reasons, Lexi?
It said because so that their arms and legs are held together. Right?
Yeah, they kind of felt that would help their limbs stay straight. So they wrap them up. And, you know, if you think about wrapping them up like that, when else in a person's existence would they be wrapped up like that?
Their burial.
At their burial. So interesting. When they begin life and at the end of life, they're wrapped up. Okay. If you had the newborns were wrapped up, how many of you had something like that? They were wrapped in cloths. Okay, we'll count that as a point, a normal point. Number 70. What does the presence of a manger tell us? Presence of a manger. What does that tell us, Luke?
They showed that it was like where animals are.
Right. This is used for animals. That's all we know for sure at that point. I think there's some other indications of exactly what animals and where they were, which relates to number 71. And we're running out of time, so I'll give you this and see how many of you got this. The prophecy in Micah 4:8 says that the Messiah was going to come to a place called Migdal Eder, or Tower of the Flock. Did anybody find out what that was? The Tower of the Flock was a tower built where sheep were kept as a way to keep a watch on them and to watch out for enemies or animals. All right, so Tower of the Flock was a place that was well known to the shepherds of Bethlehem. They knew where that was because that's where they had their sheep. And they knew that since the angels told the shepherds that the Messiah would be lying in a manger, they knew where there was a manger. There was a manger in the caves near the Tower of the Flock where they took their sheep to give birth to their lambs. Their sheep and their lambs were what was used in the sacrifices in Jerusalem. So follow this. The Jesus, who John proclaimed to be the Lamb of God, who was the Passover lamb, was born in the cave where the Passover lambs were born to be used in the temple in Jerusalem. Isn't that cool? That's the manger. It wasn't a wooden trough like we see in our nativity sets. It was in a cave, and it was just like a shelf carved into the side of the cave. Is where they would put the feed in there for the sheep to eat, and that's where they lay Jesus. Not nearly as clean as the stables that we think of, with all the straw around everything. This was a cave that would have had so much sheep poop building up year after year that it would become hard, and the floor kept getting higher and higher because of the conditions there. That's where Jesus was born, it seems to me. Not in a nice, clean stable. As lowly as that might seem, it was even more lowly. Okay, Tomorrow we'll get a count on how many questions, how many points you have off, and get a grade for that. As you probably saw on the board yesterday, section 11 is due tomorrow. So tonight, work on section 11. We'll go over that tomorrow, as well as get a grade from what you accomplished today. Any questions?